Deputy Speaker.
Are there any constituency statements by honourable members? I call the member for Fenner.
If there's one thing that sums up the ABC to me, it's the Andrew Olle I remember of my childhood listening to Andrew Olle do interviews with political figures on both sides, and he had an uncanny ability to say the word in a way that indicated that he'd heard you but didn't necessarily agree. Those conversations between Andrew Olle and Paul Lynham really shaped my view of politics growing up. I was extraordinarily proud watching Emma Alberici quiz Sergei Lavrov on the ABC, and all Canberrans were thankful when bushfire smoke shrouded our city for the constant stream of information that came from the ABC, with Dan Borscher and his team even relocating outside the studio when they were inundated by bushfire smoke. Triple J and Triple J Unearthed have provided musical opportunities to countless young Australians. In my childhood, Radio Australia, when we lived in Indonesia, was one of the key ways that many Indonesian villagers got their information. ABC Online has spread information using new platforms. Their data journalism is setting new standards, and Four Corners constantly sets the agenda. And yet, the ABC is under attack from Conservatives, or people who call themselves Conservatives but really don't understand what true conservatism means. True Conservatives would be proud of the fact that it was a Conservative government that founded the ABC, the Lyons government. True Conservatives would understand the value of institutions. True Conservatives would recognise the difference between a national broadcaster and a state broadcaster. This government is perpetrating that old view taken by Graham Morris towards the ABC, that it is, as he put it, our enemies speaking to our friends. They've cut $84 million and hundreds of jobs, and now they're pursuing an extraordinary inquiry into the complaint system, which, as independent chair Ita Buttrose has said, is an act of political interference designed to intimidate the ABC and mute its role as this country's most trusted source of public interest journalism. An Albanese Labor government will restore the $84 million of funding that has been cut from the ABC. We will show respect to an institution that has been attacked by this government who has failed to act on the recommendations of two inquiries into press freedom in the wake of federal police raids on journalists and ABC and News. As my colleague Michelle Rowland has said, the ABC doesn't always get it right and is committed to continuous improvement. But Labor will support the ABC against the extraordinary, unwarranted ideological attacks from reactionaries who used to be Conservatives.
I call the member for McKellar.
Well, I'm glad we clarified what a Conservative is. Thank you, Deputy Speaker. This October marks National Mental Health Month, with the campaign being of particular importance occurring during a pandemic which has placed a significant strain on mental health. Many people in McKellar have sought to help others throughout lockdown, recognising the needs of vulnerable community members and volunteering to help them in various ways. One person making a big difference is Avalon local Jason Partington, who is the founder of the Making Meditation Mainstream organisation. Jason started the organisation after attending a free event for men which encouraged them to open up about mental health. The high number of participants led Jason to realise he could use his expertise in meditation to help communities which have increasingly faced escalating suicide rates and mental health challenges. With 22 years of meditation experience under his belt, Jason began sharing his knowledge about the benefits of meditation, hoping to help those struggling with depression, anxiety and loneliness. Jason began the Meditation for Men course, which provides an opportunity for men to discuss mental health and learn how to easily incorporate meditation into their daily schedules. When the course started in early 2018, it involved 10 men and has since grown into the hundreds. It has also reached beyond the northern beaches, with locations in Newcastle and elsewhere along the East Coast. Jason also founded the Making Meditation Mainstream movement, which forms groups on beaches to participate in a free 20-minute meditation. It now consists of 20 groups and has gone global, with one group in the UK and another in Switzerland. Switzerland, of course, being famous for its beaches. After its success in 2020, Partington and his team ran the 28 for 28 initiative again in 2021. It encouraged participants to meditate for 10 minutes each day over the first 28 days of October. Throughout the past year, organisations such as Lifeline have recorded a massive 25% increase in support calls. Participants of 28 for 28 will pledge $28 to support Lifeline, which is the same amount it costs for Lifeline to answer a call from someone in need. It is fantastic to see community members such as Jason Partington going the extra mile and utilising, or even just using, their skills to equip others with the tools to tackle mental health issues. I encourage members of Mackellar, the greatest community in Australia, to support the 28 for 28 initiative this month and be continuing to think about ways to support the vulnerable members of the community who face particular challenges at this time.
I call the member for Cowan.
Thank you very much, Deputy Speaker. Today, the 25th of November, is the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. And right across the world, 1 in 3 women will have experienced abuse in their lifetime. 1 in 3. That figure has escalated during times of humanitarian crisis and during times of conflict. According to the UN Women, during the pandemic, 2 in 3 women reported that they or a woman that they know experienced some form of violence. Deputy Speaker, we know that violence towards women is an obstacle. It's an obstacle to achieving equality. It prevents young girls from opportunities for education. It holds women back from financial and economic security, and it perpetuates ongoing conflicts, preventing peaceful outcomes. And in Australia, we are not immune. According to our watch, 1 in 3 women in Australia has experienced physical violence since the age of 15. We have, as a nation, mourned the horrific murders of women and their children at the hands of their intimate or former partners. Women in Australia have marched in the streets calling for an end to the violence. And we know that when we raise our voices, when we shout enough, when we take to the streets, when we demand to live in safety in our homes, in our streets, in our workplaces, we know that when we speak out and when we speak up, that's the only way that we're going to make change. Now, Deputy Speaker, today launches 16 days of activism. And as part of this, I pledge that I am speaking up and I am speaking out, but I am not doing it alone. Today, I'm launching Conversations with Blokes as part of the 16 days of activism. It's a series in which I sit down and I talk to men about how they talk about violence against women. My first video is with the man I most admire, my husband, where we'll sit down and have a conversation about how and whether he broaches the subject of violence towards women with his mates, amongst all the conversations about ice hockey and car racing. I encourage everyone to have those conversations with your partner, with your mates, over a beer, over a steak. Let's keep the conversation going. Let's speak up and let's speak out and let's end violence towards women in Australia and across the world in every way that we can.
I call the member for Curtin.
Acting Speaker, 1st of December is National Water Safety Day, and this year the day will once again be focusing on championing water safety. The highest number of drowning deaths happen in the summer. 34% of total drowning deaths occurred in summer last year, and tragically there was a 20% increase in drowning deaths across Australia last year. Males are drastically overrepresented, accounting for 80% of all drowning deaths. This is an issue which is of vital importance to my electorate because the entire western side of my electorate, over 16 kilometres of it, is the most beautiful coastline in the country, if not the world. The beautiful Indian Ocean, stretching from Mosman Park to Trigg Point, which is a new addition with the changing of our electoral boundaries, is the destination for so many people, not only those in my electorate, but from all over the city and state, and when the Western Australian borders permit it, from around the country and the world as well. Our oceans and beaches are absolutely beautiful, but we also know that there are dangers, even for the most experienced swimmers. And I want to pay my respect and thanks to the surf lifesaving clubs and their volunteer members within my electorate. 7 brilliant, vibrant clubs: Cottesloe, North Cottesloe, Swanbourne Nedlands, City of Perth, Floreat, Scarborough, and now Trigg Island. Our clubs have a long history of patrolling our beaches and supporting our community. In fact, the surf lifesaving movement in Western Australia started at Cottesloe Beach in 1909. These clubs do all that they can voluntarily to keep us safe at the beach, but they do need us to do our part as well. This means we should take up the National Water Safety Day challenge and remind people to do the following. First, swim at the patrol beaches between the red and yellow flags. Wear a life jacket if boating or fishing. Avoid alcohol and drugs in and around water, and supervise children at all times. I also need to note that the Curtin clubs have a history of strong leadership and a strong track record of producing outstanding surf sports athletes. This was recognised at the recent annual Surf Lifesaving Australia Awards of Excellence, where Trigg Island Surf Club was named Australia's top surf club for 2021. This national award recognises outstanding achievement in club development that results in Surf Lifesaving Australia clubs providing safer beach and aquatic environments for the community. Given that there are 315 affiliated surf lifesaving clubs in Australia, this is without question a huge accolade and one which is absolutely richly deserved. Thank you.
I call the member for Moreton.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Make yourself comfy because I'd like to tell you a story about what I'm hearing around my electorate. Now, Moreton isn't a large electorate at only 109 square kilometres, but it is certainly a diverse electorate covering many suburbs. And this month I've spent a lot of time in one of those leafy suburbs, Sherwood. Sherwood is part of what locals call the Peninsula. It's a green suburb with beautifully renovated Queenslanders and tidy gardens and some very impressive trees. Spending a month in a suburb means a lot of door knocking, phone calls, walking the streets of Sherwood and talking to as many locals as possible. Sure, you can take note of what national polling and the pundits tell us, but nothing gives a better idea of what's going on politically than actually talking to real voters about what matters to them. Now, you might think it's strange that I'm telling you this story because I tend to leave my door-knocking stories for TikTok. And yes, I am cool enough to be on TikTok, apparently. But this story is important because it's the true story about Prime Minister Morrison in my electorate. Before the last election, when I held a community barbecue in Sherwood, after the same process, people were lining up to tell me how angry they were about Labor's previous franking credits policy. I was there with the state member Mark Bailey, and I can tell you he was pretty quick to palm those cranky voters off to me, and rightly so. In 2021, and Sherwood's a different story, people were lining up to give me their opinion about the Prime Minister, because this time around, all people wanted to talk about was how disappointed they were in the member for Cook. It wasn't so much that the Prime Minister keeps fobbing off responsibility to basically anyone who walks past his door, but that no one now believes a word he says. Now, this might be good for me, but, Deputy Speaker, it's bad for our nation. The thing is, unlike the Liberal and National Party, people in Sherwood care about our planet. They know that when the Prime Minister says that Australia is meeting and beating our climate targets, that the only target we're actually meeting is the Coalition's target to do nothing on climate. The Deputy Prime Minister made this clear at his coal train wreck interview the other day, and this was crystallised during COP26. First, there were all those days of would they or wouldn't they commit to net zero, which, remember, is the absolute minimum that this nation could do. Then he went to COP26 and promised to do hardly anything, when the whole point of COP26 was to ramp up our action, not reinforce our inaction. And just when Australians thought the Morrison government had signed up to lifting its 2030 target, on the very same day the government then said it won't agree to lift that target. Confused, so is everyone in Sherwood. I get that trust in modern politicians is an issue, but the Prime Minister has taken this to the next level, especially
I was contacted by a local charity called YouthSafe. They do good work in the community, working to prevent unintended injury for young people. They take a holistic and wide-ranging view of safety, focusing on everything from road safety to risk-taking behaviour, highlighting the main causes of harm in teenagers and young people. Their chief executive, Warren Johnson, works tirelessly and intelligently to get their messages out there and to help save lives and livelihoods. But they had a problem relating to designated gift recipient status, or DGR. DGR is common in Australian charities. Many charities use it to incentivise donations that people can claim back at the end of the financial year. We also know that many charities don't get it. We expect to claim back money for a health charity, but not a political donation. But we don't often think about what separates the two. Some types of charities automatically get DGR, education institutions, fire and emergency services, for example. If you don't fit inside these groups, often for fairly arbitrary reasons, you need to apply to the Minister for special acceptance. YouthSafe fell into this category. Interestingly, YouthSafe doesn't need DGR to attract donations. At the time, they raised very little money from donations and weren't seeking to change this model. Instead, they wanted to apply for grants, which is where the story gets interesting. Many grants are only applicable to charities with DGR status, as if DGR status confers legitimacy on a charity. Without DGR, YouthSafe couldn't apply for grants and was staring into a financial abyss. I'm delighted to say that we were able to get DGR status for YouthSafe. But it wasn't easy. It took 4 years, 6 ministers and a lot of lobbying. Treasury were reluctant to give DGR status easily, as it can be a drain on taxpayers, and, understandably, a concern, but not one that applies here. We need to create an indicator for a charity's legitimacy that is not also bound in financial or other gains. It makes sense for grants to insist on certain market markers to be met before conferring a grant. But having that marker be something that locks out legitimate charities makes no sense. In this case, all is well that ends well, but I'm concerned there are other groups out there in YouthSafe's predicament that are not lucky enough to have their stubborn persistence or a leader like Warren. We could be seeing worthwhile charities going to the wall over a tiny bureaucratic tick box, leaving the people who depend on them behind to fend for themselves. This must be a simple fix. But for now, congratulations to Warren and his team at YouthSafe, and thank you for the very good work you do.
The member for Canberra.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I rise today to talk about the crushing crisis of housing affordability and about how this government has fallen asleep at the wheel while allowing young Australians to be completely priced out of the market. Before COVID, buying a home was as hard as it had ever been, something simply out of reach for most Australians. House prices are stubbornly high and the bubble that everyone talked about seemed to be made of iron. No signs of any bursts at all. In fact, it's been the opposite. When the pandemic started, the predictions were that prices would fall. Instead, prices have accelerated. The talk was that the lack of foreign investment snapping up our housing stock would provide young Australians with a big opportunity to get into the market, but this hasn't happened. The median Sydney house price pre-COVID was $1 million. 10 months into the pandemic, and that same house would put you back an extra $300,000. $300,000 in 10 months. Now, Sydney was the worst, but we saw similar figures around the nation, including here in Canberra. Over COVID, the typical Australian house price climbed by more than 20%. In Canberra, prices have risen by 38.4%. Houses have been appreciating at a staggering rate of $720 per day, Deputy Speaker. $720 per day. Canberra is now second only to Sydney when it comes to capital city house prices. And what has the government done to address this? Absolutely nothing. They are consistent in their inaction. The government's policies are woefully out of date. The government's first home loan deposit scheme, which is supposed to allow 10,000 first home buyers the opportunity to put down a deposit of as little as 5%, is completely out of step with the reality of house prices. In Canberra, to be eligible for the scheme, the price of the property must be below $500,000. The problem is that the median house price in Canberra is more than $1 million and rising fast. A quick search on Domain shows that there are exactly 0 houses in my electorate under $500,000. And how can a young person even think of saving up for a deposit when their rent is skyrocketing and their wages are stagnant? Rental stress is at record highs and there is no sign of any improvements. Real wages over the past year have fallen 2.1%. So wages are falling, property prices are through the stratosphere and rent has become crippling. I've written to the Minister for Housing about this crisis and specifically regarding the unjust caps on the first home buyers deposit scheme, but am yet to hear a response. In government, Labor will act to make housing more affordable and less of a burden on Australians. We'll start by establishing a $10 million off-budget Housing Australia Future Fund to build 20,000 social housing properties and 10,000 affordable housing properties. Australia deserves a government that cares about housing affordability. Yet under the coalition, the great Australian dream is now impossible to achieve.
Order.
What a nightmare.
Order. I call the member for Higgins.
Thank you, thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Each year, the Higgins Medal Award gets bigger and better and continues to showcase the amazing, talented and diverse group of students attending our local schools. It recognises the contributions they make to school community, their academic excellence and for embodying the school values. Our guest speaker for this year's ceremony was none other than Year 4 Melbourne Girls Grammar School, Grace Halifax. She has an unbridled passion for maths and coding and a desire to educate other children in her community. Thanks to Grace for her inspiring speech. The future is bright with girls like Grace rolling up their sleeves at the tender age of 8 years to help their community. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd like to again congratulate this year's recipients of the medal. Lachlan Schmidt and Misha Sato from Armidale Primary, Angelica Lavadas of Camberwell South Primary, Mia O'Neill and Alexander Starkins of Caulfield Grammar's Malvern Campus, James McCliskey and Evangelos Fabiotos of De La Salle College, George Thomas and Gillian Clarenbold of Geelong Grammar School Toorak Campus, Dia Patel and Siddhant Shiriganao, Glen Huntley Primary, Sienna Vries and Ashton Sellers of Glen Iris Primary, Sky Newen and Jacob Kent from Hughesdale Primary, Jemima Khan and Zara Jaja of Karua Anglican Girls' School, Mackenzie Hughes of Lauriston Girls' School, Ines Russell and Hugh Fowd from Malvern Central School, Peter Sirudis and Lucy Freeman from Malvern Primary, Hannah Williams and Amy Russo from Malvern Valley Primary, Lily Wertheimer and Clementine Evans from Melbourne Girls Grammar, Bimal Senaviratni and Manako Banabi from Murrumbina Primary, Aidan George Gigu and Tony Stathalopoulos from Oakley Grammar, Isabella Ronchi and Hallie Dimitriadis from Sacre-Cœur, Isabella Young and Marie Elizabeth Ebby from Sacred Heart Girls' School, Abigail Phillips and James Thompson from Solway Primary, Fleur Angermont and Lucia Tabar from St Catherine's School, Grace Ogilvie and Xavier Chippendall from St Cecilia's Primary, Heath Ryan and Ingrid Piva from St Joseph's Primary, Hudson Lafroe from St Kevin's College, Alexander Goldsworthy and Alessia Rossello from St Mary's Primary, Aliri Mingus and Grace Slykerman of St Michael's Parish Primary, Gianluca Gioffri and Talia Gumasol from St Patrick's School, Kanisha Raju from St Roche School, Jack Timms from the Currajong School, Tegan Castleson from the King David School, and finally Audrey Mitchell and Harvey Coleman from Toorak Primary. Well done again to you all. You've now joined the growing Higgins Medal alumni, and I join your school, teachers, peers and family in reiterating how proud I am of each of you. The future is bright. I look forward to welcoming you to future Higgins alumni events. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
I call the member for Parramatta.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I want to talk about two very important milestones in my community in 2021. A man who made it through his first century and is embarking on his second, and a local organisation that's joining the growing Third Century Club of Parramatta. Just before lockdown, I had the honour of joining the celebration of Eric Tweedale's 100th birthday. Eric is famously Australia's oldest living wallaby. He was drafted into the Wallabies in 1946 after serving in the Navy in World War II and played prop forward, front row forward for Australia until 1949. But in Parramatta, he is best known for inspiring generations of our young people to play rugby. Born in England, Eric's family moved to Australia when he was 3. They settled in Marylands. He went to Guildford Public School and then Parramatta Intermediate School on the site that is now Arthur Phillip High School. He played his first game of rugby on Cumberland Oval in 1937, and at 17 he was selected to play for Parramatta, now known as the Western Sydney Two Blues. He would play for the club on and off for the next 21 years. When Eric retired from playing, he took up coaching and was instrumental in setting up junior rugby in Parramatta. As a coach, Eric wasn't focused on winning. It was all about having a go. And the strength of the game in the middle of rugby league heartland is a testament to his influence on generations of Two Blues players. This year, their home ground in Granville was named the Eric Tweedale Stadium in his honour. I want to wish Eric Tweedale a very happy 100th birthday once again and thank the Marylands RSL Club and Western Sydney Two Blues for allowing me to join the celebrations earlier this year. Deputy Speaker, 2021 is the 200th anniversary of Parramatta Mission. It's been an extraordinary 2 centuries. Parramatta Mission has been serving my community since Parramatta's first Wesleyan chapel was founded on Macquarie Street in 1821. Today they do the work that nobody else does. No matter who you are or what you are going through, you can find a space at Parramatta Mission, and a safe one. Their Meals Plus service provides hot meals Monday to Friday, more than 46,000 meals every year. And anyone who comes in for a meal can also access laundry and shower facilities and get help with legal and financial issues, Centrelink and housing. And I've used their services many times. When a person walks into my office, they are the ones you go to for immediate help. Most importantly, they can find someone to talk to who will listen without judgment. I want to thank all the amazing staff and volunteers at Parramatta Mission who do amazing work in my community every day. We would not be the community we are without Parramatta Mission. Congratulations on an extraordinary first 2 centuries, and I know that you will absolutely rock your 3rd century.
I call the member for Moncrieff.
Thank you, Deputy Chair. And born in 1949 in Persia, the Gold Coast's very own shining star is who I would like to speak about. He came from nothing, a familiar story on the Gold Coast where the entrepreneurial spirit was born and resides. He studied at the University of Graz, graduating with a master's degree in architecture in 1979. His family arrived in Australia in 1981, and he initially started a business selling carpets with his brother Sepp. He began his development career with a single house and rose to the chairman of the Sunland Group, where among many other developments, including Versace, he built the tallest residential tower in the Southern Hemisphere, a sister Q1 for the one he built in Dubai. He and I share a great deal in common, Madam Deputy Speaker. We have a passion in our hearts for Surfers Paradise and for the future of its regeneration and the future of its residents and visitors as the face of Gold Coast tourism. We have a passion for our community and we care deeply, as does his wife. We care so deeply about our community on the Gold Coast, and their contribution to Moncrieff and the wider Gold Coast community is to be commended. Through the Obedience Foundation and its scholarships to 80 students per year into Gold Coast universities, including my own alma mater, Griffith University and Bond University, they are changing people's lives. He's received an Order of Australia, the keys to the Gold Coast City, and last Saturday night at the Star, the Gold Coast business community came together to induct him into the Business Excellence Hall of Fame. Sahel Abedian is a good man. He's a gracious man. He's a great man. He's a man of faith, the Baha'i faith, a man of courage, a man of great principles, of determination, of compassion, and I congratulate him, his wife Anne, Sabah, Mona and Tim, and his nephew Kian for the great honour that the home of the entrepreneurial spirit has bestowed upon Sahel Abedian AM.
I call the member for Dunkley.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. The ABC and the SBS are our treasured and trusted independent broadcasters. They are not only a source of reliable news, the ABC in particular provides Australian voices, Australian faces and Australian stories to us and to our region, and for many locals in Dunkley, the SBS is a portal to the rest of the world. That's why it's so important to provide certainty for these national broadcasters with 5-year funding terms, which is exactly what an Albanese Labor government would provide, to improve their capacity to innovate and plan with the diverse ecosystems they support in education, screen production and international broadcasting. Labor has a 5-year funding commitment in addition to our previous commitment that an Albanese government will reverse the Prime Minister's cuts of $83.7 million to the ABC. We must bolster the independence and stability of our national broadcasters as a guard against political interference in Australia's democratic institutions. Where misinformation has the capacity to undermine public order, health and safety, the ABC and SBS are trusted sources of news, information and entertainment for all of us. And I hear that day in, day out from people in my electorate of Dunkley. We face political, social and economic instability at home and abroad, and we have to make sure that Australia's instruments of nation-building, democracy and culture remain strong now and into the future. And that includes independent public service media that holds power to account on behalf of the Australian people. Governments of any colour, of any stripe, being held to account by independent public service media is fundamental to a functioning democracy. So while the Liberal Federal Council voted to privatise the ABC, I'm proud that the Labor Party is united and speaks as one when it comes to the importance of our national broadcasters. We will protect the ABC and SBS as independent public broadcasters. And my community of Dunkley, arts and culture are at the heart of who we are. My recent Arts and Culture Roundtable in Dunkley with Labor's Shadow Minister for the Arts included representatives from Monash University, local musicians and actors and writers and film producers, short and long. It included the Stella Film Festival, Monash University Education Department, BAM Arts, where people with disability dance and sing and find themselves. And universally, the message was this: we have to have a better way of funding local community arts organisations, supporting individuals and groups to make our community better. And that's exactly what I'll keep fighting for.
Order. I call the member for Barker.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. My electorate of Barker spans 64,000 square kilometres and sits between the Adelaide Hills and the eastern states. There are 4 highways that connect Adelaide to the eastern states and therefore run through Barker. The Sturt Highway that takes you through the Riverland, the Mallee through the Mallee, the Dukes Highway which goes down to Mount Gambier, and the Princess Highway that follows the coastline. The Sturt Highway and the Dukes Highway are the major heavy vehicle transport routes and are a vital part of Australia's infrastructure network. The network, officially known as the National Land Transport Network, is crucial for transporting goods in South Australia. However, the Sturt and Dukes highways do not allow for the use of larger, high-productivity vehicles. This is a huge impediment for our freight industry, as existing truck limits and access constraints affect 88% of South Australia's road freight. This is constraining productivity and it's holding back progress. The high-productivity vehicles I speak of are capable of carrying 30% more freight per vehicle. This would obviously mean less vehicles required on the roads to transport the same amount of freight. Not only does this reduce costs to transport operators, but it increases safety for all road users. In an increasingly carbon-constrained world, it reduces the industry's carbon footprint. Infrastructure Australia has listed the South Australian High Productivity Vehicle Network Access, which includes the Sturt and Dukes highways, as a priority initiative of the infrastructure priority list. Infrastructure Australia proposes improving mass limits and duplicating lanes on the Sturt and Dukes highways. I can't concur enough. It's time that we look to upgrade the Sturt and Dukes highways into the 21st century. The Truro Bypass is a fantastic start, and I commend the government for the $202 million investment in this. I also welcome $143 million in infrastructure package that has included 3 overtaking lanes for the Riddoch Highway. These overtaking lanes will go a long way to making the Riddoch Highway safer for all, but quite frankly, duplication of the Sturt and Dukes Highway, that's the real fix. The duplication of these important transport routes needs to be prioritised and included in the federal government's 10-year infrastructure investment pipeline. I'm here to give notice to the federal government and the state government that I'm going to pursue this outcome with vigour. I spend too much time on the roads, I see too many accidents, and duplication of these highways is the answer.
Order. I call the member for Adelaide.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. And Deputy Speaker, I rise to speak on behalf of many South Australians who had been left waiting for months and months without an answer from the state government, the Marshall government, whether they could come home. Deputy Speaker, over the months I was contacted by hundreds of South Aussies stuck on the other side of the border. These South Australians who, for many valid reasons, had to go to New South Wales or Victoria before the lockdown. They did the right thing by applying for permission to return. They had expressed their willingness to comply with all the requirements, and yet the South Australian authorities either kept them waiting for months with no response to their emails, no response to their phone calls, and we tried on their behalf, again no response, and they were left waiting for months and months. They didn't even have the decency to reply to the applications that these people had put in. For example, I was contacted by a 7-month pregnant Daniela in Sydney, who together with her husband and 2-year-old daughter wanted to relocate back to Adelaide, where she was born and had a family. They gave an exemption to the husband and not to his wife. How ridiculous, how ridiculous. A woman who was expecting a baby, they were a couple, they gave an exemption to the husband to come back and not to the wife. They had rented a house in Adelaide, they'd packed up their belongings. So many South Australians remained stuck on the other side of the border in Victoria for months and months, Deputy Speaker. And now we're hearing of more frustrations. People that came last week were given an exemption before the borders were open. Those people are now self-isolating for 14 days. They're not allowed to leave their home. Yet, if you cross the border yesterday, from the 23rd onwards, you're free out in the community. It just does not make sense, and it's about time the state government, the Marshall Liberal government in South Australia, together with Minister Wade, answered some questions. We had over 7,000 people waiting to get their exemptions with no response, no communication. Absolutely nothing. There was another example, Danielle, who rushed to the snowfields on the 24th of July when her ski instructor's son was hospitalised. He'd had a severe accident and could not come back with her son, could not bring him back home, and had to wait for months. Again, no discussion from SA Health, no time frame saying, look, you will be looked at in the next week or so. Absolutely nothing. You can imagine the frustration of this woman who had a very severely injured son who was in hospital. He ended up in hospital here in Canberra, had to come back home to Adelaide, and just no response at all from SA Health. I think it was a debacle, a shambles. I understand that we need safety in place, and rightly so, but at least communicate with the people that are applying for exemptions.
I call the member for Longman.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Well, the past year has been challenging for many Australians across the country due to the pandemic, but I'm not wavering when it comes to fighting for the people of Longman or my vision to make the electorate the best place in Australia to live and work. So I want to take this opportunity in the final sitting fortnight of Parliament in 2021 to mention some of the important achievements we have delivered for the people of Longman this year. It's no doubt that one of the greatest challenges facing South East Queensland is managing the skyrocketing population growth while addressing the demands on our infrastructure, particularly roads. The federal government is doing its part by funding significant road upgrades in the region. For example, we're investing $530 million to widen an 11-kilometre stretch of the Bruce Highway from 4 to 6 lanes between Caboolture and Steve Irwin Way. This massive project is already underway and should be completed late 2023. While this project is a big step towards alleviating traffic congestion along the Bruce Highway between Brisbane and the Sunshine Coast, we know more needs to be done. That's why we have invested $10 million towards a planning study for a western alternative highway between Beerburrum and North Brisbane. The new major transport corridor will ultimately help alleviate congestion on the Bruce Highway north of Brisbane and will accommodate future growth in the area, particularly as a massive Caboolture West development is realised. We have also invested $130 million towards the upgrade of the new Settlement Road overpass, making this busy junction safer and more efficient for road users. A further $30 million in federal government funding has been committed to Bribie Island Road to improve safety and improve traffic flow at critical sections of the road, which is used by thousands of motorists every day. We are also partnering with the Moreton Bay Regional Council on around 20 different local infrastructure upgrades, from new footpaths and park upgrades to pedestrian safety measures, streetscape improvements, sports field upgrades and small road projects. These grassroots projects were made possible through the federal government's Road and Community Infrastructure Program to stimulate the economy during the COVID pandemic and keep people in jobs. Some of these projects have already been completed and I'm pleased to say are already making a positive difference in our local community. Many others are underway. Mobile phone coverage and network issues have long been a sore point for some communities in the Longman electorate. I've lobbied long and hard on this issue and fought for improved mobile services and adequate coverage for every corner of Longman on behalf of the people in my electorate. I'm pleased to see that we have been heard. Longman has received funding for 7 mobile infrastructure upgrades through the Black Spot program and is set to receive further upgrades through the federal government's new peri-urban mobile program. I will continue fighting for this and other projects that are much needed in our community. Finally, Deputy Speaker, it has been my privilege to be a member of the government that has provided dozens of grants to local schools and community groups to help them cover the costs of vital upgrades and improvements to their facilities. Watch this space, there's more to come.
I call the member for Solomon.
Thanks, Deputy Speaker. Darwin and Palmerston, my electorate in the Northern Territory, is an incredibly diverse community of Australians and international students, workers from the Pacific who are picking our mango crops. There's just people from all over the world doing all sorts of things, and I just want to acknowledge a recent event in my electorate. It was a pop-up art show for NT Legal Aid's Your Rights Through Art project at the Northern Centre for Contemporary Art. The project began as a workshop for international students living in the Territory, using art classes to engage, empower and educate them about their legal rights in Australia. Whilst they're studying, they're working. The students also learned about respectful relationships, employment, money and renting rights, as well as developing new artistic skills such as different painting styles, drawing, watercolours and collage. I'd like to congratulate the winner of this project, Nadira Yasmin Nila, and the People's Choice Award winner, Eva San. Now, Nadira, who was the winner, had incredible artwork, and it really went to her experiences in Australia. She's just finished a nursing degree and volunteered to go down to the COVID outbreak down in Katherine and the communities that are hard hit by COVID outbreaks around Katherine, to volunteer as a nurse. Basically, as soon as she graduated, she put her hand up to go down there and help. Now, her experience, an unfortunate one, but something that we can all learn from, is that she was working for a big multinational company in the food retail business, and she had a boss that said to her, "Get that hijab off. We don't want you in this workplace with a hijab on." She's a young woman, a Muslim from Bangladesh, and she broke down and had a very difficult time coming from that overt discrimination. So she really appreciated, obviously, being part of this event. International students are so important to us. And like many international students and migrants, she worked through that discrimination, and she's supported by the wonderful people such as those at the NT Legal Aid. I want to thank the Community Legal Education team at NT Legal Aid, the NCCA, the Northern Centre for Contemporary Art, and in particular Patrice, that does a great job running that, and the NT government who made this project possible. Despite the hardships they've faced, with the support of the community, I just want to let international students know how welcome they are.
The member for Solomon, and I call the member for Riverina.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In the worst of times, we see the best of Australians, and particularly regional Australians, and we have definitely seen that in recent days in and around Forbes. Of course, that town on the Lachlan River has been besieged by the rising floodwaters. Indeed, hundreds of homes were under threat. Many of them had water running through them, and now the big task of ripping up the carpet and doing all those messy and muddy things once a flood goes through will be the job for those residents. But I want to say thanks this morning to all of those who helped, willingly, voluntarily, and doing what they could for their colleagues in the town, and indeed for strangers who they may never have met before. And I have to say also, thank you to all the volunteers who came from all parts of New South Wales to render assistance. And I spoke with a number of them. They were from the Upper Hunter, they were from Kempsey, they were from all parts of our great state, there to lend a hand in a dire hour of need for the people of Forbes. I also want to say thank you to the many businesses which have provided free coffee, free care packs, from the smallest coffee shop in town right up to Woolworths. Indeed, Telstra had a meeting this morning with the Regional General Manager, Chris Taylor, and others in relation to the Telstra packs that were made available and taken up by 121 residents, providing free data, free calls and assistance when and where it's needed. 50,000 sandbags were filled by State Emergency Service, by just people wanting to protect their own homes. And of course, outstanding effort by the Mayor, Phyllis Miller, and her Shire Council team. Phyllis Miller is one of the great mayors in my electorate, if not the state, and I know big things are in store for Phyllis as far as the local government is concerned. But you saw the best, and we saw the best of Phyllis during this crisis. And the crisis is not over yet. The whole town is looking to the skies and watching the river and the levels of the floodwaters, and hoping that more rain doesn't tumble down, that the river doesn't rise anymore, because the danger has not passed yet. But thank you to all of those full-time and volunteer helpers who have pitched in mightily to save what they could. I appreciate that there is hundreds of millions of dollars done to farms, to crops, and Forbes will get through it because it's a very resilient town, a fantastic town in the Riverina.
Well done.
I call the member for Bruce.
Thanks, Deputy Speaker. I'll just say at the outset I do accept that you can't call the Prime Minister a liar. That's unparliamentary, and so I won't do that.
Order. The member for Bruce will withdraw that and commence that again, please.
It's a statement of fact. I'm not allowed to. But if it assists the chair, I'll withdraw that. It is strange, though, isn't it? It is strange. Even when the entire country is saying just that, you couldn't read out the headlines in most of the newspapers in this chamber. They're calling into question the Prime Minister's pattern of a loose relationship with the truth. That is parliamentary, well established. Here we must use nicer words. We can say untruth, we can say falsehoods, we can say a pattern of mendacity, or as Winston Churchill famously said, to get around this very problem, terminological inexactitude. A bit of rhyming slang apparently is okay. The old Bob Cryer, Dunlop tyre, sounds like flyer. But it is beyond question that the government is led by a man regularly observed as falsifying, misleading, avoiding, deceiving, dissembling and double-dealing, making stuff up in common parlance. Now, I've read the practice. You can't make imputations on character or motive, but you can observe on the behaviours. That's entirely parliamentary. But there are real-world consequences to the Prime Minister's pattern of behaviour, or factual inaccuracies if we want to be neutral. The Prime Minister told Australians that we were at the front of the queue for vaccines, but that wasn't true, was it, Deputy Speaker? We were last in the developed world. Months of lockdowns Australians endured because of this guy's spin and marketing. The Prime Minister told Australians that he'd deliver higher real wages, but that's not true. The Prime Minister last year presided over an economy where real wages fell by $700. In his first 6 years in government, when he was the Treasurer, real wages in this country went backwards under this government, backwards, near last in the developed world. He told journalists he wasn't on holiday in Hawaii, but that's exactly where he was. Wasn't true, was it? The Prime Minister claims he's opposed to mandatory vaccinations, except that's not true either, is it? He's imposed them on aged care workers, Australians returning home, quarantine workers, even journalists who attend his press conferences have to be vaccinated. The Prime Minister says Labor's always higher taxing and higher spending and Liberals are lower, except the two highest taxing, higher spending governments in the last 30 years have been Liberal governments. Some of his untruths are just weird though, aren't they? He forgets that the television records things and you can watch it. He didn't ridicule electric vehicle technology, he said, except he said they'd end the weekend, wouldn't tow a trailer and stop Australians going camping. He said he didn't support Clive Palmer's challenge to the Western Australian borders, except he spent $1 million of taxpayer money doing just that. He said he never said Shanghai Sam, but he said it 17 times on 11 occasions. How can Australians trust anything that comes out of this Prime Minister's mouth, given his record of falsehoods, day after day after day?
The member's time has expired. And order, member for Leichhardt. I call the member for Bowman.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and I rise today to speak about vaccine mandates. Look, we know how important vaccination is, and Australia's now risen to one of the most vaccinated countries in the world, but I've always argued that additional coercion and pressure doesn't get you much result. You might move a small percentage of people who need a nudge, but you start getting distortions and deadweight loss, and what we're now seeing is martyring of those that definitely don't want to be vaccinated. It's not terribly helpful. As a medical practitioner and a registered specialist at that, we will win this and we will vaccinate this population, and we don't need to move to non-evidence-based mandates. And I want to be very clear what that is. Of course there's a evidence base for vaccinating anyone, any worker in contact with COVID cases, in the healthcare system, in aged care, disability. There's very, very strong public health evidence. As we move from that, Fair Work has very clearly indicated there's a number of tiers where the degree of reasonableness falls away as the evidence weakens. And in public health, we need to make sure that that evidence is provided freely, fairly, openly, publicly, and in real time. Not enough CHOs are doing that, and that's a real loss for our country if, unlike the Commonwealth and CMO and the AHPPC, we're not releasing this evidence. It must be if possible. Otherwise, you end up with this appalling situation I'm seeing in Queensland, where it is alleged that practitioners will, for a fee of $5,000, squirt the vaccine on the ground and sign you off as having been vaccinated so that the unvaccinated can get around the mandates. That kind of behaviour is not what we need in a democracy and in a high-quality health system like Australia. Inconsistencies in border travel, in people flying in from overseas. If they fly via Sydney, they get hotel quarantine in Queensland. If they fly direct to Brisbane, it's home quarantine. Inconsistencies not based on public health evidence. So Sunday week, the 5th of December, 9 a.m, Cleveland Library, I'll be talking about these vaccine mandates, where they belong and where they have no place. I'd also like to talk about homelessness in my electorate, a really important issue. I made a pledge 3 years ago that no Redlander should live without a roof over their head. And the last week we've seen a complete collapse again in homelessness survey services, with Homeless United being defunded by the state Labor government. A perfectly working 98% successful program, replaced with the North Side drive-in, drive-out service of part-timers. It's not good enough, Minister Enoch. And I've spent the last 2 days on a full-court press trying to help a family with 6 children who were left in the rain in a park, living in a tent because there were no services. But I want to say Queensland Housing rose to that challenge. They moved the earth to get this family housed. They are now housed, and I'm so proud that Queensland Housing lifted where providers were not able to. And we need to remember this, that some of us will find ourselves in these terrible situations without a home. No child should be like that. I want to thank Andrew and Helen Drysdale from Pat Barrett Realty, who stayed with that family until we got them housed. Thank you.
I call the member for Bendigo.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. The cricket season is upon us, and as men and women across my electorate start to train, I'd really like to encourage all of our women's teams this year. I was the inaugural trophy, the Lisa Chester's Trophy for the local Bendigo cricket competition last year. It was the first time that we had a competition that included both of the leagues come together to play. And this year will be another great year for women's cricket in Bendigo. But, Deputy Speaker, what we need is facilities. We have more and more women taking up the sport, wanting to play. But we don't have the change rooms that's required. We want to host bigger competitions. We want to host some of the big teams coming to our area, but we don't have the facilities that we require. Now, we're not asking for brand new facilities. What we're asking for in our part of the world is funding to help upgrade the facilities that we have. Local government can't do it alone. State government is assisting, but we really need the federal government to get involved. We really need the help. And at the moment, there isn't a fund to help these facilities. The advice that I get back is to apply to the Building Better Regions Fund. But to date, our electorate has done poorly in the allocation of funding from this. It's also to become a bit of a catch-all excuse for government ministers. So in the regions, if they don't have a fund, if they're not willing to help out, they tell everybody to apply for the Building Better Regions Fund. And that's just simply not fair and not workable. How can a small cricket club like Axe Creek Cricket Club compete against the City of Greater Bendigo? They simply can't, and they just continue to miss out. Sports frauds was a problem for this government, but it was a great idea which was just poorly executed. And it is disappointing that we haven't seen another community sports fund come about because the idea was right. Let's help our regions, let's help our communities refresh, rebuild, revamp their facilities so that people have the infrastructure that they need. Kyneton Soccer Club is still waiting for its new pitch. It's been very wet in Victoria, like large parts of Australia, and the end of their soccer season, they had to play away because their ground was waterlogged. They could have got money through the fund, but later we found out that that money was taken away and given to another project, which is disappointing because the ground still needs to be upgraded. Projects that are too large for local government, but not large enough to get on the government's radar. We need extra funding. We need the federal government to partner with local government and clubs to upgrade these facilities.
And I call the member for Casey.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. As members of federal parliament, we all have the great privilege of meeting incredible members of our local communities. Great Australians who do so much for their community. The role of government is vital, but the role of those working in the community is equally important. It's the glue that holds everyone together on a day-to-day basis. There are so many people in my electorate of Casey and so many in each of yours, but today I just want to focus on one, and that is Neil Grist. I've known Neil for 20 years, the entire time I've been the member for Casey. In September, he turned 98. He's a World War II veteran. He, after the war, worked in a variety of jobs. He studied at night school for 4 years to gain some qualifications in his specialty of marketing and public relations. He's a long-standing member of my party. In fact, he was the first local Liberal member I met when I was standing for pre-selection 20 years ago. Above and beyond that, he is a stalwart of the Croydon RSL, where he has served with great distinction, helping veterans in need over all those years. Neil's history is a great Australian story, and today I wanted to place that on the parliamentary record. He's been a great member of the Liberal Party, a great member of the RSL, and a great community contributor. At 98, he's, as you'd expect, had a few physical health issues along the way, but his mind is as sharp as ever, and his compassion is still there for his fellow veterans at the Croydon RSL. These are the people that do so much to make Australia what it is, doing so much over so many years without asking for reward or recognition. But I just felt today Neil Grist, who I haven't been able to see for a long period of time as a result of the restrictions we've all been facing, deserves some of that recognition. That World War II generation that did so much for us so long ago, and then after years of service came back to Australia to build the country that we are today and to serve in so many other ways as he's done over decades. To Neil, congratulations on everything you've done, and I wanted to mention you today in the Federation Chamber of the House of Representatives.
Well done, outstanding contribution, first time in a long time. Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. I ask leave of the Federation Chamber to move that the notice of today number 1, committee and delegation business, be postponed until a later hour this day.
Leave granted.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I move that the order of the day number 1, committee and delegation business, be postponed until a later hour of this day. Thank you. That was your most outstanding contribution. Oh, thank you. Thrusting and probing. Going.
Committee and delegation business, order of the day number 2, second interim report of the Joint Select Committee on implementation of the National Redress Scheme.
Call the member for Barker.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Make no mistake, as we emerge from COVID-19 pandemic, we are experiencing another arguably more alarming one, the shadow pandemic. As this report states, approximately 1 in 5 Australians and nearly half of all adults will experience a mental or behavioural condition in their lifetime. Over 65,000 Australians make a suicide attempt each year, and over 3,000 Australians sadly end their lives that way per year. I've been aware of the need to improve mental health services. Indeed, one of my very first campaigns when I ran for the federal parliament was to establish a Headspace facility in Mount Gambier. I was pleased to deliver this, and the Limestone Coast youth now have an access to important mental health services. Now, I'm campaigning for an adult head-to-health centre for Barker, because I know that we need to improve access to community-based mental health services to a broader demographic, particularly in rural and regional communities. As this report outlines, the committee has heard that across the board there are insufficient services to treat people, whether with preventative interventions, low-level care or indeed high-level interventions. Services are needed to cater to different populations, especially those who require acute care, living in rural and remote areas or at risk of suicide. Madam Deputy Speaker, following the finalisation of this report, the South Australian coroner handed down the findings of an inquest into a death of Theo Nicholas Papagiorgio, who, at the age of 27, died as a result of compression of the neck due to hanging. While this inquest did not form part of the committee's inquiry, I want to take the opportunity to outline the circumstances of Theo's death that highlights quite blatantly the failing of our mental health system. The Deputy Coroner found that Theo's death was preventable. The inquest uncovered multiple failings in the mental health system in the Riverland, the regional community where Theo lived and worked. Despite Theo's parents doing their unquestionable best to seek support for Theo that Theo needed, lack of appropriate facilities, services and disjointed service provision failed Theo and it failed his family. Theo was misdiagnosed. There was no communication between the clinicians in the Riverland who saw Theo, and there was a culture of passing the buck. Theo was placed on an inpatient treatment order at the Riverland General Hospital in November 2015. But the Riverland General Hospital did not, and still does not, have a closed ward capable of keeping Theo detained past the initial 7-day order. Rather than moving Theo to an appropriate facility in Adelaide, he was sent home despite being clearly and profoundly mentally unwell. Theo was floridly psychotic and was having delusional thoughts at this time. The inquest found that the psychiatrist who had recently taken over the case was overwhelmed by work and did not have the full background of Theo's case. The Deputy Coroner remarked that, in many ways, it is astonishing that the psychiatrist would not have been aware of Theo's complete mental history going back to 2014, and that it is difficult to see how a discharge of Theo could have been contemplated as early as the 2nd or 3rd day given his presentation. A couple of months later, Theo's condition had deteriorated and he had fallen into severe depression. At that point, Theo's parents attempted twice to have Theo detained again through presentations at the Emergency Department of the Riverland General Hospital, that is, a private-run service operated by GPs. The mental health ward Theo had previously received treatment in is located under the same roof but operated by the state government. Both attempts by Theo's parents to have Theo detained again were denied in the emergency department and Theo was sent home. The coroner notes that because of the divide between the mental health ward and the emergency department, no consultation notes were passed between the services. The morning after Theo's parents' second attempt to have him detained, he was found dead. Theo's death occurred 3 days before he was due to see the, quote, visiting psychiatrist, visiting being the key word here. The inquest heard that funding issues affecting country mental health services still exist more than 5 years after Theo's death. Recommendations of the coroner's report include the need for more psychiatrists in country South Australia. There are currently only 3 psychiatrists in country South Australia focused on acute and semi-acute cases, and 2 of these are in temporary positions. As this committee has heard, to address workforce issues, the federal government established an independent task force, the National Mental Health Workforce Strategy Task Force, to work with the Commonwealth Department of Health and the National Mental Health Commission to develop a 10-year national mental health workforce strategy. The committee has also heard from the Royal Australian and New Zealand College of Psychiatrists reinforce access challenges, particularly in regards to psychiatrists. This is something Theo and his parents faced firsthand. The federal government is committed to funding $11 million so far to boost the psychiatric workforce by increasing the number of training places available, including in regional and remote areas, as well as additional funding to provide scholarships and clinical placements for nurses, psychologists and allied health practitioners. As the committee comments, over the years, Australian governments have made commitments to providing equity of services to regional, rural and remote communities, yet Australia is still has unacceptably high numbers of people unable to access services they need in the right place at the right time. The committee was pleased to see the additional money in the 2021-22 budget to increase training places for psychiatrists and scholarships and clinical placements to develop other mental health professionals, noting the skewed distribution of the mental health workforce and the focus of these placements should be on strengthening, and I stress, strengthening the regional, rural and remote mental health workforce. While the federal government takes the lead on a 10-year workforce strategy that includes training more places for psychiatrists, the state government must immediately move to decentralise increased mental health service provision. As Theo's case tragically highlights, we desperately need more psychiatric services in country South Australia. Currently, there is very little support for regional staff that do work in country Health SA's 13 mental health teams, a system that is, as Theo's case identified, completely inadequate. The few psychiatrists that do work in country SA, which, as the visiting psychiatrist that saw Theo, are overwhelmed by work. Madam Deputy Speaker, I've been part of this committee and I've heard the evidence presented. I've also represented regional communities in South Australia, including the Riverland, where Theo Papagiorgio lived, worked, and was a well-respected and much-loved member of the community. I also chair the Parliament's Select Committee on Regional Australia. I know that our regions are a great place to live.
A division has been called for in the House. The proceedings are suspended to enable honourable members to attend the division. The proceedings will resume.
For Barker.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Mr Deputy Speaker, before we adjourn for a division in the House, I indicated that I've been a part of the work of this committee and I've heard the evidence presented. I also represent regional communities in South Australia, including the Riverland, where Theo Papagiorgio lived, worked and was a well-respected and much-loved member of our local community. I chair the Parliament's Select Committee on Regional Australia. I know that our regions are great places to live. I know that people that live in our regions are resilient and punch above their weight. I know that they do this while not having access to the same level of services as those who live in metropolitan areas. That's just the reality. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, regional people deserve better than what this report has highlighted. Theo and his parents, Poppy and Jack, deserved better. The committee heard that Lifeline Australia estimates that for each life lost to suicide, the impacts are felt by up to 135 people, including family members, work colleagues, friends, first responders and others. Imagine, Mr Deputy Speaker, what this does in a regional community that is by definition far more connected. As governments, we need to do better. The report makes it plain. And this is not just at a federal level. I will be meeting with the South Australian Minister for Health to discuss the coroner's report that I've spoken about today and its important recommendations, including that we make resident psychiatrists available and to regional South Australians. The system, sadly, is failing, and I'll be fighting at every level within my own government and with the state government to listen to this committee's recommendations and those of the South Australian coroner and act now to ensure that we put as much effort into the shadow pandemic and the mental health challenges as we've put in to the COVID-19 pandemic and its challenges. Mr Deputy Speaker, I commend the report to the House and I thank Jack and Poppy Papagiorgio for allowing me to speak about Theo in this place.
The honourable member for Macquarie.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. There have been many reports into Australia's mental health system and its failures are well known and widely discussed. High costs for many patients, shortages, terrible shortages of psychologists and psychiatrists that mean long waits or long distances to travel or people simply not seeking the help that they need. That's particularly the case for children. Big gaps in treatment for eating disorders, failures of community care and an horrific suicide rate. Our committee already knew these things and our inquiry has been focused on what's got better or worse as a result of a summer of bushfires across much of the nation and COVID. And of course, for areas like mine, you add in floods. What we found is that COVID rushed forward what might otherwise have been tentative and overdue steps to telehealth, giving people no option if they wanted to continue their treatment and providing for some an easier access to new treatment. But of course it hasn't worked for everyone. As we say in the report, while evidence strongly supported the increased availability of telehealth, there was broad agreement that it was most effective as part of a suite of mental health services. We supported the calls by the Productivity Commission and others to make permanent the access to psychological therapy and psychiatric treatment by video conference and telephone introduced during the COVID-19 crisis, and we need to see that funding and that allowance made permanent. We'd also like to see ongoing funding for digital mental health research, considering the increased prevalence of mental health problems and rapid expansion of this virtual mental health care. But for any step forward, there have been steps back, and the need for mental health services has blown out as a result of the disasters that we've experienced and the pandemic. I asked one witness, at what point do resilient people like those in my community who faced fire, flood and COVID affecting every aspect of their life, at what point do those people flounder? And his answer was simple. He said, "You're resilient until you're not." I speak with people on an almost daily basis who, as a result of the consequences of bushfires, floods, COVID, the impacts on their business or their work or their access to family members, the effects of isolation, say that that's broken them as never before. We know that when it comes to natural disasters, the greatest need is not necessarily the day after the disaster. It might be weeks, months, or even years. Each one of us is different, and we can't easily predict what will break someone, but what will make someone else stronger. We do know, though, that from Black Dog Institute figures, every year more than 65,000 Australians make a suicide attempt. Suicide is the leading cause of death for Australians between 15 and 44 years of age. Young Australians are more likely to take their own life than die in motor vehicle accidents. And the suicide rate among Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is approximately twice that of non-Indigenous Australians. So a key recommendation of our report is to make services accessible to everybody. And that means physically accessible and financially accessible. Help needs to be affordable. We recommend looking at the viability of bulk billing incentives that are currently available to GPs being similarly made available to other mental health practitioners where patient affordability is an issue. Safe access to services needs to be increased for the LGBTIQ+ communities, for people who are culturally and linguistically diverse, for people in rural and remote areas, and for First Nations people. And a number of the 44 recommendations in the report request urgent action on these matters. And of course, for young people, we heard much evidence about the impact of the pandemic and natural disasters on young people. Patrick McGorry, Executive Director of Origin and Professor of Youth Mental Health at the University of Melbourne, points out that the system was already woefully unable to meet the level of need even prior to the pandemic. He estimates a 30% increase on top of the normal level and describes it as a mental health emergency where young people who are seriously ill in life-threatening situations cannot get the help that they need. I want to talk about schools and the conclusions we drew after taking much evidence about the important role they play and could play in the future in helping young people manage their mental health, helping to prevent suicide and assisting with emotional well-being. We heard that, as I think we would all know in this place, school counsellors play a vital role. They bring qualifications to the job that make them a key part in many young people's lives of tackling these complicated issues, but also we heard of the impossibility of the task, given how few of them there are. When you hear of a counsellor having a day or two a week at a school, it's no wonder there are kids failing to access that support and that counsellors report an impossible workload. We've recommended that the government work with state and territory governments to increase the ratio of school psychologists to a minimum of one full-time equivalent on-site for every 500 students across all levels of schools. This will support the work already happening in some states, but it needs to be a minimum. We need to make sure that the best use of government funds is made in our schools to ensure quality mental health support. We can't underestimate the benefits of early intervention, of access to quality mental health services. It's obviously the right thing to do, but it's also the cost-effective thing to do. There are such big gaps for young people, and I see them in my own electorate in the Hawkesbury, where there is no headspace to allow an easy access and early intervention for young people. They need to be able to walk through youth-focused doors and be dealt with by people who understand where they're coming from. And as the Katoomba Headspace shows, build it and they will come, as Katoomba's demand has exceeded its expectations since opening 18 months ago. It is shameful that there's no Headspace in the Hawkesbury and that this government has done absolutely nothing to fix that problem. One of the big obstacles that we see in many of the issues related to improving access to mental health services is workforce. There wasn't a single witness who told us that they had all the workers that they needed to meet the demand. The government needs to act on finalising the National Mental Health Workforce Strategy as a matter of urgency. We have multiple recommendations in this report to address workforce issues, such as extending funding to 5-year cycles so organisations like Primary Health Networks can offer some security to their workers beyond 1 or 2 year contracts, which may help reduce people leaving for more secure work. Another issue we looked at is around the role of peer support, and there is more work to be done to ensure that the lessons being learned about peer workers and the role that they can play are shared across the country. Suicide Prevention Australia told us that less than half of the people who die by suicide access or may even need to access the mental health system. They talked about life events that can lead to suicidal distress, such as marriage breakdown, economic instability and/or job loss, and housing distress. They are the elements, they said, that have an impact on a person's potential suicide risk. So instead of a focus on mental health support, they want to see a model of peer support, where it's not about a clinical issue, but mates helping mates. And we certainly see these approaches happening in the building industry in my electorate. These sorts of workforces are critical in ensuring there's a safety net for people, preventing them from getting into suicidal distress. Our committee also recognised the work of pharmacists and other allied health professionals and the extraordinary things they do in this space. We didn't overlook carers, for whom the current system doesn't work well. It doesn't support them. And we recommend a national carer strategy, which includes a way for unpaid carers to be integrated into care teams and to access training for suicide awareness and prevention. I want to thank the many individuals and groups who made submissions to this committee, including the Mountains Youth Services team from my own Blue Mountains. Their evidence of the high rate of suicidal ideation that they see in clients was confronting, and the support they provide to young people in crisis situations is no doubt replicated by other similarly underfunded organisations, remembering that many of these services are designed to provide broad youth services rather than specialist mental health services. I make particular mention of Committee Chair Dr Fiona Martin, member for Reid, who has led this committee and ensured, I think, that no voice was left unheard. And to Deputy Chair, the member for Debelle and the member for Werriwa, I want to thank you both for your commitment to the intense winter days in quarantine and lockdown that we spent taking evidence. And I acknowledge my other committee members. It was clear that our collective determination to see action on these matters drove the work we did. I commend the report and thank the Secretariat for their work in making it possible.
I call the honourable member for Ryan.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. And can I start where the previous speaker left off and acknowledge all the work done by the committee, and in particular the committee chair, the member for Reid, who has worked incredibly hard on this report, as have all members of the committee, including myself. But having somebody with the qualifications of the member for Reid and her passion and stewardship for this inquiry has been incredibly beneficial and certainly been borne out in the recommendations. We must all work hard to break down the stigma that has historically surrounded mental health. I know that that's something that has bipartisan support, and further to break down the barriers that may be present that prevents anyone from connecting with the help and the services that they need at their time of need. We know early intervention is key throughout all significant stages of life, providing support to parents through pregnancy, providing the foundations in schools, and then as children transition to adult life. I want to commend the Chair for her work in detailing what needs to be done to address in particular the issues surrounding the need for specialist workforces to address and continue to adapt to changing environmental factors in our lives that contribute to our mental health. I want to also thank all of those who made submissions, the many organisations that lent their considerable weight and expertise to the committee's finding. The committee recommends increased funding for specialist services such as forensic, perinatal and autism services to innovate, expand and meet demand. Dealing with these workforce issues really is the missing piece of the puzzle. As more funding is being provided by government to Medicare and to individuals to access mental health services, too many providers, especially those targeted at the young, are reporting significant issues with filling the workforces to meet demand. The fact that the committee had a significant focus on these workforce issues is to its credit. I note also that it was pleasing to see the success of programs put in place during the pandemic, such as telehealth, that gave immediate access to help. There aren't too many silver linings of the COVID-19 pandemic, but this is surely one. In the normal course of business, I have no doubt that it would have taken years of consultation, probably a decade, to convince doctors and patients of the role that telehealth could play in health services. Instead, it was introduced in a matter of weeks, with patients and health professionals given a very practical demonstration of how successful it could be and the circumstances in which it could be useful. It's now an enduring legacy. It won't replace face-to-face healthcare, and nor should it. That will remain paramount, but it clearly has an important role to play in ensuring that vulnerable communities have access to the services they need. The pandemic also has elevated the importance of crisis mental health. The recommendation of the committee that the Chief Health Officer for Mental Health also be present at all state and territory crisis meetings is important so that mental health considerations can be made at the time broader health orders are, and I hope to see this adopted in the future. While I don't think that considerations of those mental health impacts will change the medical advice, I hope it will ensure that mental health support that may be needed as a result of implementing some of those orders is available quicker and to those communities who need it. Whilst the report identifies the need to prioritise youth mental health, I think there is far more that we can do. I personally have more ambition for this space than the report does, and I want to see far more funding for our young people who are experiencing mental health challenges. Research clearly shows if we can get young people support early, we can head off a raft of problems and pain later in life. We can prevent them and assist them not to develop those chronic mental health concerns that will plague them as an individual and lead to such a loss of happiness and economic potential. The report was hesitant to single out the success of individual services, but of course I have no such hesitancy and want to particularly pay tribute to Headspace for the vital work that it does for young Australians who are experiencing mental health at crisis point. It's doing magnificent work, particularly my service in the electorate of Ryan in Taringa, which is the second busiest in Australia. And I know I will continue to fight for more funding, and we as a government need to continue to further support and fund these centres. Particularly, I know that there is extra funding on the table for these centres, ongoing funding, as a result of the recent budget. It's waiting on the support of state governments, including the Queensland Government, who have shown no urgency or desire to sign up to a funding agreement with the Commonwealth. And my call to them is that mental health support, particularly for young people, is beyond politics. It's something that, on a bipartisan basis, is supported and encouraged, and I can see no reasonable reason why the Queensland Government isn't engaging in very fruitful talks with the Commonwealth Government to ensure that Headspace and other youth mental health services have the ongoing funding that they need. Mr Deputy Speaker, finally, I also want to record my support for the school chaplaincy program. It supports over 3,000 school communities Australia-wide, providing pastoral care and programs such as breakfast clubs, activities and workshops, especially in my electorate of Ryan. Before this place, I spent a decade as a local councillor working with my local schools, and I have seen firsthand, time and time again, the wonderful pastoral role that chappies play and the important impact they make in a young kid's life. They are embedded in their school community, they're strongly supported by those school communities, especially parents, and because they are one of them, so to speak, the kids, but not a teacher, but one of them, the kids feel it much easier to talk to them about issues they might be facing both at school and at home. I do not think there is a need to review this service, as the committee report recommends in number 41. I think the Chappie program is effective and is greatly needed, as I have seen firsthand. But if there is to be a review, it is my sincere expectation that its finding will show the National School Chaplaincy program is so effective that it should be given more funding and more support to continue the excellent work it does in our schools and to ensure it's rolled out to more schools to support the health and well-being of students. That's my position, and I believe it is the position of the Coalition Government, who has always had unwavering support for the Chappie program. This committee report is the product of a lot of hard work, particularly by the Chair and the committee members, and I want to thank them and commend it to the House.
I call the honourable member for Werriwa.
Thank you, Deputy Chair. I rise also to make my contribution to the Mental Health and Suicide Prevention Select Committee's final report. The committee was tasked with providing recommendations based on a number of reports that have been released over the last 3 years and provide a roadmap for improvements to reduce suicide and the suffering that ill health causes our community. As we've all experienced in the last 2 years, Australia has been presented with many events, both here and overseas, that have challenged our normal way of life and caused stresses to many. The horrific fires of 2019 touched all Australians, with many losing their homes and livelihoods. And just as people were getting back on their feet, many states in Australia were flooded. But since 2020, we have all endured the COVID-19 outbreak. COVID, through necessity to keep us safe, has taken away what humans really crave the most, the support of family and friends. This was, of course, for the best of reasons, but it has increased the incredible stress for many Australians and the mental health system that supports them. Extended lockdowns have meant families and people have been touched by isolation. They've missed significant events with their families and friends, exacerbating the fear of the unknown, and that has affected every corner of the earth. The 2020 Productivity Report, the Royal Commission into Victoria's mental health system and various other investigations into Australia's mental health provisions have highlighted that the system is suffering from affordable access for all Australians who need support for their mental health. Issues with your mental health can affect every part of your life, relationships and physical health. It can affect a person's capacity to care for themselves and others and hinder a person's capability of participating in social and family events. Approximately 1 in 5 Australians and nearly half of all adults will experience some sort of mental or behavioural condition in their lifetime. It can be episodic, acute or chronic. It is clear from the evidence the committee heard that early intervention and proper evidence-based support is what can make a difference in people's lives and ensure they are able to improve their mental health as soon as possible. The committee heard that although advances have been made in many conditions, and misunderstanding and stigmatisation is still a problem for many people. This stigma leads to deferred action and can lengthen the time that someone is unwell. The final report released by this committee proposes evidence-based recommendations that will steer our approach to mental health in the right direction. It shows there is a need for a big-picture approach to mental health in Australia to account for long-term effects of the pandemic. I see it in my community, where rates of mental health are skyrocketing without appropriate services to deal with them. Amplifying Voices during COVID-19 report, recently released by the Western Sydney Migrant Resource Centre, found the impact on mental health was the biggest issue across diverse backgrounds. There is also a feeling among diverse communities across the country. This is why the committee has recommended that Commonwealth
Commonwealth Fund training resources for mental health workforce that can provide culturally appropriate and sensitive services to both Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but other called communities and gender diverse individuals. Time and again during the hearings, we were told about the lack of appropriate services to support those who were struggling. Teenagers are waiting months for support in a time of unprecedented stress. For 2 consecutive years, Year 12 came in and out of online learning with a HSC around the corner. This is an exam in the best of circumstances that can cause extreme stress for its participants. We also heard in successive hearing about the severe lack of services in regional and remote areas. There needs to be a decisive and comprehensive action to address issues in this sector. Professor Ian Hickey said the mental health system should provide the right care first time. He believes that governments need to model in advance what the outcomes of our system should be, who needs to be involved in the service delivery and how best that can be achieved moving forward. Professor Hickey put to the committee that modelling has shown that if all these things are agreed upon around Australia, we could spend approximately $14 billion a year on mental health. If we don't make these decisions and continue a business-as-usual approach, we will see Australians spending $22 billion a year in a system that is still not functioning efficiently. All the evidence the committee heard pointed to workforce shortages and overwork of those professionals in the system. At times in some communities, especially in our outer suburbs and regional and remote areas, there are long waiting lists. Improvement in mental health are best achieved with timely support and appropriate medical assessment and interventions by, in many cases, multidisciplinary teams. We need more psychologists in schools, better access to see professionals, affordable services, an expansion of digital services, funding for regional and remote services, and for culturally appropriate support for called and First Nations citizens. The committee has recommended the Commonwealth investment to determine the long-term impacts of trauma and how it is compounding with successive natural disasters. But any decisions that are made require data to ensure plans are made properly and limited resources are used efficiently to make a difference. The committee also recommends that accessibility be at the forefront of all policy making. This recommendation, along with the investment to determine the long-term impact, will go far in identifying mental health in Australia. Identifying the causes and being aware of these causes is a fundamental step in the process of mental health and suicide prevention. The inclusion of the National Mental Health Workforce Strategy within the Department of Health and the National Mental Health Workforce Strategy Task Force is one recommendation which will be a positive blanket effect on mental health and suicide prevention. This strategy involves a national standardisation of suicide prevention training for all health and allied health professionals. The committee recommends more work be done in schools to combat mental health. This includes an independent evaluation of the effectiveness of all existing programs supporting the wellbeing of students in schools. Increasing the number of psychologists in schools will make a huge impact on the outcome of these programs. Also, training teachers with wellbeing and mental health support is essential for a positive outcome. Teachers need to be prepared to respond appropriately if a student reaches out for help. And throughout the hearings, we also heard about the importance of IT-coordinated care. Professor Hickey also urged that receiving the right care at the first time is crucial. He argued with no widespread adoption of smart healthcare technologies, this could easily be developed to support a wide range of organisations. Australia is a leader in mental health care innovation, but we lack the fundamental IT backing that can improve support across the sector. NBN and access to telehealth is a problem throughout Australia, but particularly in regional areas where there are also a lack of face-to-face medical specialists in the community. Professor Hickey talked about the urgent need for support in regional and remote areas. He believes the system as it stands is not structured for the benefit of regional areas, and non-government organisations are doing little to help. Professor Hickey also advocated for regionalisation. which means a cooperation between federally funded primary health networks, state-run services and the non-government sector, as well as a strong active action from private health to address the gaps in services. I would like now to thank everyone who took the time to make submissions and who so generously provided their expertise in hearings over the last 9 months. Your insights and assistance with our questions is very much appreciated, and I hope you can see your particular information in our report. I would also like to thank the Secretariat for their practical support during this inquiry. I appreciate so much their organisation of online forums, which for much of the time they were also working remotely. I would like to thank my fellow committee members for the collegiate and bipartisan approach to this committee, especially the member for Macquarie, the Deputy Chair, the member for Dobell, and the Chair, Dr Fiona Martin, member for Reid. I'm truly grateful to all of you for assisting me to understand this area of policy formation. I commend the recommendations of the report to the House.
The question is that the document be noted, and I call the member for Berowra.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow my friend, the member for Werriwa, and I note her good work on this committee, as I note your work on this committee as well, Deputy Speaker, and the leadership of the member for Reid and the member for Dobell and other members, including the member for Ryan, the member for Stirling, the member for Macquarie and the member for Barker. This is a very important and serious report, and although I was not a member of this committee, I chair the Parliamentary Friends of Suicide Prevention and have a long interest in this issue, having been bereaved by suicide, having lost my father, a matter I spoke about in my maiden speech some years ago. You can see the amount of work that has been done on this report by the fact that it's 336 pages and there are 44 highly considered recommendations. One of the things I think that the government has done recently is it's put together a whole series of streams of advice on mental health and suicide prevention, of which this report is the latest. Anybody who's had a chance to read the Productivity Commission report, and I know the Productivity Commission report will have been thoroughly considered by this committee, will have known the way in which they tried to consider the whole environment, the whole regulatory architecture, the interplay of Commonwealth, state and non-government sectors in dealing with mental health and suicide prevention. I think the most significant thing in the Productivity Commission report was the statements about universal aftercare. And I'm very pleased that the government in the budget earlier this year committed to providing universal aftercare. I believe that is the game changer in relation to making a serious dent in the suicide numbers in this country. One of the things that I think the Productivity Commission did not get right is I think they actually understated the number of people whose lives could be saved as a result of universal aftercare. Deputy Speaker, when you have a hip replacement or a knee replacement, you go into rehabilitation. They don't just send you home. But in too many of the states of Australia, unfortunately, when you're admitted to a mental health unit, the practice has been just to discharge people into the night, into the street. That's not appropriate. Universal aftercare provides a step-down rehabilitation, constant contact for people who have suffered a mental health illness or indeed who've attempted to take their own life. Why this particular measure, I think, can make such a difference is because, unlike other measures in the suicide prevention area, we know that the people who are most at risk of dying by suicide are people who've had a previous attempt. And so if you've had a previous attempt, we know who you are, we know where you live, we can put in place things to take care of you. Now, we won't save every life, but we will certainly save more lives than we are now as a result of having proper universal aftercare. So I want to commend the government on that. The second thing I want to note, and I want to draw attention to a particular part of this excellent report, is that the government has announced a $114 million grants program for organisations to engage in community suicide prevention activities, which I think is very important. I think the missing piece that remains in what we have rolled out in terms of suicide prevention is universal suicide first aid that can be rolled out in workplaces. And I'll illustrate why I think workplaces are important in a moment. But one of the most important things that we can do is to look out for others and to notice the signs and know what to do if we see the signs that somebody might be contemplating suicide. I note that the inquiry report talks about promoting wellbeing in the workplace and says, and I quote, "There's now greater recognition that peer-based early intervention case management models can dispense with the need for professional gatekeepers and thereby help ease the burden on the health system." And they note, through its own experience, Mates in Construction stated the issues seen in workplaces are not going to be a surprise to anyone. Relationship issues for 38% of those presenting, work-related issues are about a quarter, family issues are about a quarter, and financial stress is about 1 in 7 cases. Recognising the fluid factors in suicide prevention and the fact a significant number of people may not see a psychologist or other mental health professionals, the Australian Association of Psychologists, Inc. spoke in support of community focus on suicide prevention, including education in the workforce and in areas where rates of suicide may be higher. The Chamber of Minerals and Energy of Western Australia agreed mental health issues in society require a holistic approach, acknowledging the role employers have to play in addressing mental health as a community issue. And I want to commend the work of Mates in Construction and Mates in Mining and other organisations that are workplace-based in terms of providing that suicide first aid. I want to explain why I think workplace-based suicide first aid delivered nationally is going to be such an important thing. In 2018, I challenged my community in Berowra to become a suicide-safe community. What did I do? I gathered 170 community leaders from 170 different organisations in my community together for a night at the local RSL club, and I had one of Lifeline's suicide prevention trainers come and talk to the community organisation and put them through what was then called a Lifeline Accidental Counsellor course. I then challenged those community organisations to go and roll out a similar course within their organisation, whether it was a church or a PNC or a Rotary Club or a local community progress group or a scouting body. And I have to say, we had also the council and we had the hospitals, both public and private, there with us. I'm pleased to say that around 20 organisations took up that offer and put on events like that. I'm also pleased to say that a new organisation, Mentoring Men, founded by Ian Westmoreland, was born as a result of that night, and that other organisations like the Hornsby Ku-ring-gai Community College staged a suicide prevention day as a result of that. But where I saw real uptake of the suicide first aid courses was in the large employer organisations, the hospitals and the council. And it made me realise that while my original objective had been, let's get it done at the community level, let's get people in community groups to stage this, actually there is a real benefit to staging suicide prevention training in the workplace in a way that is appropriate to the particular workers and the particular employees and the particular management of that workplace. And that's something I think that Mates in Construction and Mates in Mining do so well. There are other organisations like Lifeline, like Wesley Lifeforce that provide similar sorts of courses. I know that staff in this place do the mental health first aid version of a course from an organisation called Mental Health First Aid as part of the services that are offered by Ministerial and Parliamentary Services, and I commend the Parliament for providing those services. But this shouldn't be something that's just available to people who work in this place. This should be something available to everyone because, in my view, we can put in place structures to improve the operation of the medical side of the system and the psychological side of the system. We can do things like increase, as the government has done, the number of Medicare-funded psychological counselling sessions that you can have in any 1 year. But the thing that will make a difference, I think, on the ground, more than anything, is just having more people looking around at their neighbours, their friends, their family, and saying, their conduct has changed. I'm going to ask them the difficult question, are you contemplating suicide? And knowing what to do following asking that question. So, Deputy Speaker, I support the idea, and it's not an idea that is covered in this report, I should say, but I wanted to use this occasion to raise it publicly, of organisations like those I've mentioned and others taking advantage of that $114 million suicide prevention grants that are available to work together to roll out a national workplace-based suicide prevention training program so we can all better look out for our neighbours, our friends and our colleagues. I think this will have a really significant impact on the suicide rate in this country, which sadly remains far too high. I want to again commend colleagues on both sides of the House for the way in which they have worked to produce what is a very significant contribution to the public discussion and to the public policy in relation to mental health and suicide prevention in this country. There is no more important social policy issue in my view than to save the lives of our fellow citizens. And we have far too many people dying by suicide in this country every single day. And I believe that these recommendations deserve serious consideration by government and other public policy makers in terms of what we can do to improve Australians' mental health and to reduce the suicide rate in this country. Thank you.
Call the member for Moore.
Be adjourned until a later date.
Is the motion seconded? Member for Wells seconds the motion. The question is that the debate be adjourned. All those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. The ayes have it. The member for Moore.
I move that the Federation Chamber do now adjourn.
Is the motion seconded? I second the member for Wells seconds the motion. The question is that the motion moved by the member for Moore be agreed to, and I call the member for Gilmore.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Well, it is perfectly clear to me the only way to achieve satisfactory action on climate change is to change the government. Moving away from the dependency upon fossil fuels requires an actual renewable energy transition. Only an Albanese Labor government will provide that certainty. Deputy Speaker, people in my electorate tell me the climate crisis is the biggest challenge facing the planet. But I firmly hold it is also the biggest economic opportunity in front of Australia and in particular our regions. We should be the renewable superpower. Deputy Speaker, in my electorate of Gilmore, we have amazing community groups leading the way on renewable energy, like Repower Shoalhaven, a not-for-profit volunteers renewables organisation that not so long ago raised $500,000 in community finance in just 2 days. Repower Shoalhaven is an incredible community group made up of volunteers that are so passionate about seeing more renewables right across our region. It just goes to show what can happen when local community is leading the way. The establishment of the Shoalhaven's first solar farm, 10 hectares of low-value land near Nowra Hill, transformed into a productive, ambitious asset, 8,000 enormous solar panels, generating 6,000 megawatts of clean energy a year, the equivalent of about 2,000 homes. However, Deputy Speaker, this is only half of the story. The leadership of Repower Shoalhaven is within their partnership also with energy retailer Flow Power. Deputy Speaker, you see 20% of this clean, renewable energy is already allocated. And to whom? The City of Sydney Council, Deputy Speaker. So again, from a former low-value, unused space south of Nowra, renewable energy is generated, enabling the City of Sydney Council to achieve their zero emissions target 9 years early. Could there be a better win-win-win? Community involvement through Repower Shoalhaven, local government involvement, local businesses to benefit by purchasing the power, job creation, local investor benefits with returns tracking at 5% per annum. And, Deputy Speaker, announced only yesterday, the University of Wollongong's Shoalhaven campus will use 100% renewable energy generated from the Shoalhaven Community Solar Farm. Chair of the University of Wollongong Sustainable Futures Committee, Professor Tim McCarthy, saying, and I quote, "Keeping our energy dollars in the region gives us satisfaction, and having it at the doorstep of our Shoalhaven campus is perfect alignment." Deputy Speaker, if this is not the definition of circular economy, I couldn't tell you what is. Then there is SHAZA, the South Coast Health and Sustainability Alliance, with the President speaking publicly that a key aspiration of SHAZA is to have a community solar farm in the Eurobodalla as well. So, Deputy Speaker, the Gilmore electorate want to see more solar farms. We want to see more electric vehicles. Where are the EV charging stations along the South Coast? There is no charging station between Canberra and Batemans Bay. Deputy Speaker, we want to see more renewables jobs on the South Coast. This fulfilled dream by Repower Shoalhaven of a solar farm shows that it is truly possible. It just needs a federal government that will support it. The world is moving rapidly towards renewable energy. We have a once-in-a-generation opportunity for Australia to jump ahead of the pack. The Morrison government can't be trusted on renewables. In the past 8 years, this government has announced more than 20 energy policies and delivered nothing. The Prime Minister's untrustworthiness is undermining Australia's international reputation and interests. Labor would turn good climate policy into good jobs policy and create work, long-term secure work in the process, additional to helping reduce power prices and emissions. We have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to seize this change. In the interests of our regions, we need a government that has the ambition to seize these opportunities, and that is an Albanese Labor government.
The question is that the motion be agreed to, and I call the member for Moncrieff.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Once again, we've seen the Queensland Health Minister, Queensland's Darth Vader, make an attempt from the dark side to send out into orbit the space junk that the state government has created with vaccination mandates and testing confusion to enter the great state of Queensland. Now, during this pandemic, we've seen the Queensland government time and again do what they do so well, deflect from their own failures and their responsibility to provide Queenslanders and those who seek to enter Queensland with a clear pathway when it comes to testing and travel. The tourism and small business sectors, who have suffered blow after blow, have now suffered further due to the confusion caused by the Queensland Health Minister and the Premier around resident and holiday access restrictions to Australia's favourite playground, the Gold Coast. Now, the Queensland government created this confusion around testing requirements to enter Queensland so that the Premier could position herself to ride in on the white pony, nothing against white ponies, Deputy Speaker, and be seen to rescue Queenslanders from the peril of paying for testing every time they cross into the Tweed to go to work or to enter Queensland. I reject that this confusion was caused by the federal government, Mr Deputy Speaker. The truth is that the Queensland Premier signed an agreement with the Commonwealth on 13 March 2020 to meet the Commonwealth 50-50 to split the difference for PCR testing with the states and the territories. Has she forgotten, Deputy Speaker? Did she forget that National Cabinet meeting, Deputy Speaker? The arrangement has not changed. It remains in place. There's no new agreement on testing regimes with the states and the territories. What changed, Deputy Speaker? What changed was the Premier decided that travellers or returning Queenslander, border workers, or perhaps she didn't decide, they maybe had to prove a certificate for their testing status. You see, to produce a certificate, a pathology request form is required from an issuing GP, and the results were reportedly the cost of $145 per person, per test. How much is that for a family of 6, Mr Deputy Speaker? That's why the tourism sector went into unnecessary meltdown on the Gold Coast. They went into further angst and damage control for our key economic pillar on the Gold Coast. Then the Premier once again moved the goalposts. She said during a press conference, yeah, an SMS would be fine. Yeah, that'd be fine. Just like that. Just like that, the rules all changed. This is the power the Premiers have. The tests are free, Mr Deputy Speaker. They're free due to the agreement that I just outlined. They've been free for 18 months. As anyone who has been tested knows, these come from testing centres, Mr Deputy Speaker, not GPs with a request form. For clarity, the Commonwealth and the states together pay 50-50 for testing of people with COVID symptoms and that attend mass testing clinics without seeing their doctor, and people who require a test as a result of a state or territory public health order, including domestic travel as a result of a state border restriction, close contacts without workplace testing requirements in high-risk settings. It's very clear, Mr Deputy Speaker. The rules were already very clear and in place. The Commonwealth, through Medicare, funds tests for people who have COVID symptoms or are suspected of having COVID. And these tests are ordered by a doctor, and the patient will have a pathology request form for this service from the doctor, and there is a cost associated with that. And so my point, Deputy Speaker, is that it's absurd that the Queensland Health Minister and Premier stood up and said that the Commonwealth should pay through Medicare for all the costs of testing for state-imposed border restrictions on travel when there is already an 18-month-old agreement in place, which they would have been well aware of. You can see where I'm going with this, Mr Deputy Speaker. It's all about the politics. A pathology test will only be charged for a patient when they are required to obtain an official certificate, rather than using the existing text message system that is in operation in every state and every territory. It's the Commonwealth that has spent over $1.87 billion on pathology testing throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. It's the Australian taxpayer, the Queensland taxpayer, who has funded testing, and it's the Australian taxpayer who rightly should not have to pay to enter the great state of Queensland. So I wish to be crystal clear when I say that the federal government does not mandate COVID-19 vaccinations, except in the case of those working with aged care and vulnerable people. Vaccination is free and encouraged, Mr Deputy Speaker, and it should be businesses on the Gold Coast, the entrepreneurs on the Gold Coast, who decide who comes into their business, not the state government.
The question is that the motion be agreed to, and I call the member for Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker. I wanted to speak today about higher education. And I noticed that the Prime Minister made an announcement yesterday about higher education and research funding for a number of universities yet to be selected. Of course, Labor is supportive of any extra funding for higher education. Universities have had a very tough couple of years with COVID-19, losing billions of dollars of revenue from international students not able to come to Australia. Universities need more support, and as I've said many times before, they are one of our country's most vital set of institutions. Universities drive innovation, they underpin new industries and products, they help educate a new generation of skilled workers. But it is really a little much to be listening to the Prime Minister talking about this sort of university funding after the 2 years of ignoring universities and the traumatic impact that that has had, ripping the heart out of our universities. The government has spent years ignoring the impact of the pandemic on Australian universities. The Prime Minister deliberately excluded universities from JobKeeper wage subsidies. Those opposite changed the rules 3 times to make sure that universities would be excluded. And the consequence of that are thousands of jobs lost right around the country, in our cities, of course, in our suburbs, in our regional communities as well. Thousands of university workers, 40,000 in fact, have lost their jobs. It is an astonishing attack on one of our most important export sectors. New technologies don't come out of thin air. New breakthroughs don't come out of thin air. We need researchers to invent or discover them, and thousands of researchers have been amongst those who have lost their jobs. An estimated 7,000 researchers have lost their jobs in just the last 2 years. So the Prime Minister announces something yesterday about industry, university, research collaboration. Who does he think will be doing this work? It is so disappointing. These researchers from science, technology, engineering, maths, IT, the humanities, medicine, law, we've seen campuses closed, including in central Queensland, those opposite who claim to stand up for regional communities. What about Biloela, the Sunshine Coast, Yeppoon? All of them have lost university campuses. We've had research programs, important ones, close their doors. Just recently, the National Centre for Flood Research in Lismore, which I have visited twice, has closed its doors. The National Centre for Flood Research, this is world-leading research that was being done here on the campus of Southern Cross University in Lismore. Right now, when much of New South Wales is actually underwater, we're talking about whether for the coming years the El Niño effect will mean more risk of floods and we're closing the doors of this unique research centre. This is one example. I could give you dozens like this. The government has spent 8 years savaging our researchers, and the Prime Minister thinks he can make up for that with scraps at the last minute. The problems go so deep. In 2016, a survey of medical researchers found that 83% of them had considered leaving the profession. The Australian Postdoctoral Reference Survey found that over half of our early career researchers have thought about moving overseas. We need to turn this around. If we want to be a prosperous and successful nation, we can't have our best and brightest fleeing overseas because they can't get a job in Australia. According to research by Harvard University, Australia has the economic complexity of a developing nation. We are squashed between Uganda and Burkina Faso as the 87th most developed complex economy in the world. We won't turn this around without strong universities, and we won't rebuild our universities with a Liberal government. It is only ever Labor that invests in our universities. Mr Deputy Speaker, instead of trashing our universities, instead of turning his back on our researchers and then thinking that at the last minute he can announce some funding and turn the whole show around, this Prime Minister should be held to account for the devastation that he has inflicted on our tertiary education sector.
The question is that the motion be agreed to, and I call the member for Bonner.
Well, thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I rise today to recognise our local Aussie manufacturers. Whilst out in my electorate of Bonner this month, I visited some of these homegrown manufacturers, seen for myself the incredible quality of products being made in our backyards. The Morrison government recognises the job-creating power of Australian manufacturers, and that's why we've invested $1.5 billion to establish our modern manufacturing strategy. We're supporting Australian manufacturers to scale up and create the jobs that we need now and for generations to come. Deputy Speaker, Bonner is home to Murray-based defence business Cyborg Dynamics Engineering. The Morrison government has awarded them a $3.3 million contract in their pursuit of an Australian first. It was a privilege to have a tour of Cyborg's HQ by CEO Stephen Bronstein. Stephen has been named one of Australia's 30 most innovative engineers, and in 2017 was recognised as the Australian Young Engineer of the Year. He now has grown an exceptionally motivated team focusing on robotics and artificial intelligence, with his first contract being the company's first with the Defence Industry Innovation Hub, enabling them to develop an unmanned combat vehicle, the likes of which have never been made in Australia. Deputy Speaker, Queensland is once again proving how it is at the forefront of strengthening Australia's defence capabilities. What's more is that groundbreaking work is happening in Bonner. Cyborg Dynamics are developing first-of-its-kind innovations and integrating an array of supporting Australian technologies into a robotic platform. This has the potential to enhance the load carriage, fire support capabilities and the protection of dismounted soldiers. It's a major win for Bonner and one which is securing 20 local jobs. Investing in our defence industry is a key priority of the Morrison government to keep Australians safe and support businesses and jobs right across the supply chain. Deputy Speaker, I also dropped into Murray's MidMed medical suppliers and caught up with Managing Director Rob Muller and General Manager Paul Gapes. MidMed is yet another true blue Aussie family-owned business. They are also a national leader in supplying medical equipment. As you'd imagine, during this time, business is rapidly growing and they're keen to shore up even more of their manufacturing capabilities. This is exactly what we want to hear our local manufacturers are striving for. It was great to talk about how we could make this possible to enable more local jobs and opportunities for our skilled workers. Deputy Speaker, to see Aussie-grown business go from strength to strength this time is remarkable. Our government will continue to enable opportunities for them to showcase their innovations, and as for our green and gold logo, to have a stronger presence on home soil and internationally.
The question is that the motion be agreed to, and I call the member for Kingston.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Well, look, Australia has had a proud history in manufacturing, but under this close to decade-long Liberal government, we've seen really a waning in support for that manufacturing. In my home state of South Australia, whether it was Holden and Elizabeth or a range of other manufacturers have struggled without the support that they need from government. Of course, Australian-made products go much beyond just providing jobs and jobs for Australians. They provide a high-quality product, and this was a quote made by one of those key manufacturing businesses in my electorate. Australian made goes beyond simply where the product is made. It's the fact that it's been made for you, for your lifestyle, for your passion. It's made to survive the unique landscapes and the extreme conditions. That's so true. When products are made in communities, they meet communities' need. Now, if anything has shown, if we've learnt nothing from this pandemic, and I hope we've learnt a number of things, I think it has been that we have lost the ability to make too many products here in Australia. And I think this is very, very concerning. So as we emerge from this pandemic, we need to make sure that we're supporting manufacturing, that we're ensuring that manufacturing has a good future in this country. And now, of course, we do already, despite the Liberals' inaction, have companies that have worked hard and have survived. And I've got some wonderful manufacturing businesses in my electorate. Adelaide Profile Services, which cuts metal and steel in my electorate. We've got Roland's Metal, which does steel fabrication. I've got Team Poly that manufactures tanks. It's been so wonderful to see them expand. We've got Red Arc, as I mentioned, who makes custom-made batteries. These are just some of the great manufacturing businesses in my electorate. But they do need their government to back them. And if we're going to see an expanding manufacturing sector, we need government backing them. That's why I am really pleased that Labor has already announced, if we're elected, we will have a focus on Made in Australia. We will support and encourage businesses to be able to be part of the government procurement process. We buy a lot of stuff as government. We build a lot of stuff as government. And I hear from many, many small, very good manufacturers, they don't know how to be part of the process. That's why I'm so pleased that Labor said that they will establish a Future Made in Australia office to support local industry in taking advantage of government purchasing and opportunities. And I'm pleased that this will be backed up by laws that will lock in key elements of the Commonwealth procurement rules to actively support local industry to take advantage of government purchasing opportunities. We'll also support small and medium business by decoding and simplifying government procurement processes. This is going to be very, very critical. But of course, we need the skills to actually deliver, to take up these jobs as we expand our manufacturing business. And it has been incredibly disappointing that under the Morrison-Joyce government, there are 10,000 less places for apprentices and trainees in South Australia. This means fewer skilled job opportunities available for locals and less qualified employees. I am really pleased that Labor has already put out a number of important policies, including the Australian Skills Guarantee, which will ensure 1 in 10 jobs on major federally funded infrastructure projects are given to apprentices, trainees or cadets. We need to use the power of government, our procurement power, our building power, to actually support Australians, whether that's Australian businesses, whether that's Australian jobs, We can do a lot better, and I'm really proud that with the election of an Albanese Labor government, we will take steps to delivering this.
The question is that the motion be agreed to, and I call the member for Monash.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Today the Prime Minister introduced a religious discrimination bill, and in doing so talked about all the good reasons why we as a nation must say no to discrimination in all its forms. He noted that this bill will add to existing Commonwealth legislation that criminalises discrimination on the basis of age, race, gender, disability and human rights. It's rather ironic then that while this bill is being debated today, unvaccinated people in Victoria are on the receiving end of some of our country's harshest discrimination restrictions. Let me paint a picture of this repugnant discrimination. Yesterday, my friend, who I'll call Kate, not her real name, rang to let me know that from today she can no longer go to a local agricultural hardware store to purchase feed for her livestock. While pet stores are considered essential, stores that sell livestock feed are not. But it turns out that the store also sells petrol. And because petrol is deemed an essential retail item, my friend was confused about why she couldn't simply pick up some feed at the same time as paying for the petrol. Having lived in this tight-knit community for more than 10 years, Kate knows the staff well. In fact, they were a lifeline during the recent electricity blackouts after the storms, when they helped source a generator for her. She even promotes the business to clients because of their friendly and competent approach. When Kate entered the store, she saw all the new signs to remind her of the need to check in with her vaccination status. A bit bemused about what these signs might mean for her as an unvaccinated person, Kate half-jokingly asked the manager, "Can't I come shopping anymore if I'm not double-vaxxed?" And to her utter shock, he replied, "No, you can't, effective tomorrow morning." Kate then asked, "So if I come in tomorrow and fill my car up with diesel, can I come in and pay for it?" And he said, "Oh, that's different. You can buy petrol, that's essential. I can't ask you about your medical status when you buy petrol." This is exactly the same checkout at which Kate pays for the other items. A bit perplexed, Kate checked a bit further. "So you're saying that livestock feed is not essential?" The manager said, "Kate, the advice has come from the top. I'm just following orders. You have to disclose your medical status." Kate, who was of German heritage, took a deep breath and replied, "Sorry, but I come from a country where they once just followed orders." "Don't worry," she said, "I won't make your life a misery, but I won't return until this madness stops." How can these restrictions be based on so-called science or health advice? You only need to look at the different approaches across Australia to know it can't possibly be, or at least that clearly there's a broad range of health advice that can be chosen to suit one's own political needs by government. For instance, how is it that New South Wales is reducing restrictions for unvaccinated people at the same time Victoria is doubling up on them? We are a fractured nation of people who are hurting. And I don't understand why more of us in this House aren't standing up to call out this divisive and repugnant discrimination. I know this woman to be strong and resilient, and she says she's okay. But the point is that she shouldn't have to be okay. What about the hundreds of thousands of people that are not okay? The ones that for many and varied reasons have made the choice that they would prefer to lose their job, risk their home and their ability to care and feed for their family, rather than be coerced into accepting a new vaccine about which they are unsure. The government has spent a lot of money so-called educating people about what they're on about. But it comes down to me for looking like coercive control, isolating you from the support systems, the Victorian government, I should say, isolating you from your personal support systems, preventing you from meeting up and spending time with other family members and friends, monitoring your activity through the day by exactly what I did before I came in here, denying your freedom and autonomy, malicious name-calling, belittling, being put down, limiting your access to money or jobs, controlling aspects of your health and body. My friend is one of the strongest, most resilient people I have ever met in my life. But it breaks my heart to know that she is enduring this. if you're unvaccinated in Victoria, you will be persecuted. You will be ostracised. Why do you think there's 50,000 people marching in the street in Victoria? There is a bright side. Deputy Speaker, there's always a bright side. The connections they're making with like-minded people and themselves are the connections that will last them for the rest of their life.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. All those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. The ayes have it. The Federation Chamber stands adjourned until 10:30 a.m. on Monday the 29th of November 2021.